That's your child, Gabriel.
Then get rid of it before my enemies use it against us.
You're asking me to kill our baby? I'm trying to keep you alive.
He pressed a cold, heavy hand against the pristine marble island. Get rid of it. I don't want a child, Gabriel's voice echoed, utterly devoid of the warmth he had once promised. That was the last time Echo saw him until 4 years later, when two little faces exposed her greatest lie. New York City was a playground for the untouchable, and Gabriel Rossi was its undisputed king. To the readers of Forbes and the Wall Street Journal, Gabriel was the enigmatic CEO of Rossi Logistics, a multinational shipping empire with headquarters towering over the financial district. But to the NYPD, the FBI, and the hushed whispers in the back rooms of Balthazar and the Polo Bar, Gabriel was the ruthless head of the most powerful organized crime syndicate on the East Coast. Echo Adams had known none of this when she first spilled champagne on his Tom Ford tuxedo at a charity gala at the Plaza Hotel. She was a 24-year-old art restorer, living paycheck to paycheck in a cramped Brooklyn apartment. He was 32, fiercely handsome, and possessed an aura of dangerous magnetism that pulled her into his orbit before she even realized she was falling. For 2 years, Echo lived in a gilded cage. Gabriel moved her into his $50 million penthouse in Tribeca, complete with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Hudson River. He draped her in Cartier diamonds, bought her a wardrobe straight from the runways of Milan, and fiercely protected her. But as time wore on, the cracks in the facade began to show. She noticed the burner phones. She saw the men in tailored suits with suspicious bulges beneath their jackets who guarded their front door. She woke up to the smell of copper and smoke on his clothes when he returned at 3 a.m. She knew what he was, even if they never spoke the words out loud. Then came the morning that shattered the fragile illusion of their life together. Echo sat on the edge of the master bed, her hands trembling as she stared at the plastic stick resting on the mahogany nightstand. 2 solid pink lines. The morning sickness over the past 3 weeks hadn't been stress from her gallery work. It was a life. A tiny, fragile life growing inside her. Despite the darkness surrounding Gabriel's world, a surge of maternal hope bloomed in Echo's chest. Gabriel loved her, she knew he did, in his own possessive, fractured way. Maybe this was the catalyst they needed. Maybe a child would be the reason he finally stepped away from the syndicates, the violence, and the shadow of the federal indictments always looming over him. She waited until he returned that evening. Gabriel walked into the penthouse, shrugging off his bespoke suit jacket, his jaw tight with the exhaustion of a man fighting a war on 2 fronts. He poured himself a generous glass of Macallan 25 before turning to her. "Gabriel," Echo began, her voice softer than usual. She stood up, smoothing the fabric of her silk dress. "We need to talk. I went to the doctor today at Mount Sinai." Gabriel's dark eyes snapped to hers, a flash of genuine concern breaking through his stoic mask. "Are you sick? If it's that heart murmur again, I'll have Dr. Eris flown in from Boston tonight." "No, I'm not sick," she said, taking a step closer. She reached out, resting her hand lightly against his chest. "Gabriel, I'm pregnant." Silence descended on the penthouse. It wasn't the shocked, joyful silence she had desperately prayed for. It was a heavy, suffocating stillness, like the atmospheric drop before a hurricane. The warmth completely drained from Gabriel's face, leaving behind the cold, calculating expression of the mob boss his enemies feared. He stepped back, breaking the physical contact between them. He set his whiskey glass down on the marble island with a sharp clink. "No," he said simply. Echo blinked, the word not quite registering. "No? Gabriel, I'm at least 8 weeks along. We're having a baby." "I said no, Echo." Gabriel's voice was dangerously low, a lethal quietness that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. "I don't bring children into this world. My father was a monster who raised me in a slaughterhouse. I am surrounded by men who would slit my throat for a fraction of my territory. You think I'm going to put a target on a child's back? A target on your back? We can leave," she pleaded, tears pricking her eyes. You have enough money. We can go to Europe, to the Amalfi Coast, anywhere. We can just disappear. You don't just disappear from the commission, Echo, he snapped, his voice finally rising, echoing off the high ceilings. He ran a hand over his face, steadying his breathing. When he looked at her again, his eyes were dead, devoid of any affection. Get rid of it. I don't want a child. The words felt like a physical blow to her stomach. You want me to terminate the pregnancy? I'll have Hayes make the arrangements, Gabriel said coldly, turning his back on her. There's a discreet private clinic in Lenox Hill, the best doctors. You'll be in and out in an hour, and we will never speak of this again. I am protecting you, Echo. One day, you'll understand. He walked out of the room, leaving her standing alone in the massive, empty penthouse. As the heavy oak door clicked shut, Echo placed a protective hand over her stomach. He thought he was saving her. But at that moment, Echo realized the only monster she needed saving from was him. 2 days later, a black Cadillac Escalade sat idling at the curb outside a luxury medical building on Park Avenue. In the driver's seat was Hayes, Gabriel's most trusted enforcer, a hulking man with a scarred eyebrow and unquestioning loyalty to the Rossi family. Echo sat in the back, staring blankly out the tinted windows. She was dressed in a simple trench coat, a designer silk scarf wrapped around her neck to ward off the crisp autumn chill of New York. Her purse sat heavy on her lap. Inside was her phone, her wallet, and a platinum credit card tied directly to Gabriel's offshore accounts. "We're here, Miss Adams," Hayes grunted, shifting the SUV into park. The boss said, "I'm to escort you to the 4th floor and wait in the lobby." "Thank you, Hayes," Echo said, her voice eerily calm. She stepped out onto the busy Manhattan sidewalk. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, but she kept her face impassive. She walked into the gleaming marble lobby of the clinic, Hayes trailing a respectful 5 paces behind her. As they reached the elevators, destiny or perhaps just sheer luck intervened. Hayes's encrypted burner phone buzzed violently in his breast pocket. He pulled it out, his expression darkening as he read the caller ID. "Miss Adams, wait a moment," Hayes said, stepping toward the glass doors of the lobby to get better reception. "Yeah? What do you mean the feds are at the Brooklyn docks? Listen to me." That was all the distraction Echo needed. The elevator doors chimed and slid open. Instead of stepping inside, Echo pivoted sharply, slipping behind a large decorative fern and pushing through a door marked stairs, emergency exit only. She didn't run down. She knew Hayes would check the street level first. She ran up to the 2nd floor, weaving through a maze of dental offices, until she found the service elevator used by the janitorial staff. She rode it down to the basement parking garage. In the dim light of the garage, Echo moved ruthlessly. She pulled the GPS-tracked iPhone from her purse and tossed it into the bed of a random pickup truck. She unclasped the $40,000 Cartier Love bracelet Gabriel had bought her for her birthday, knowing it had a micro-tracker embedded in the clasp, and kicked it under a parked sedan. She walked out the delivery exit onto a narrow back alley, hailed a passing yellow cab, and paid the driver in cash she had been secretly hoarding for a week. "Port Authority," she told him, not looking back. Over the next 48 hours, Echo became a ghost. She knew Gabriel's reach. He owned judges, police captains, and airline executives. She couldn't fly, and she couldn't use a credit card. At Port Authority, she bought a Greyhound bus ticket to Philadelphia under the name Sarah Jenkins. From Philly, she took another bus to Chicago, and then another heading toward the Pacific Northwest, before abruptly getting off in a small, rainy coastal town in Oregon called Astoria. She cut her long blonde hair into a blunt bob and dyed it a mousy brown. She pawned a pair of diamond earrings Gabriel had overlooked in a pawn shop 2 towns over, yielding enough cash to rent a small, run-down cottage near the docks and buy forged identification documents from a shadowy contact she met through a bartender. Echo Adams died in New York. Clara Evans was born in Oregon. 7 months later, Clara Evans was rushed to the local county hospital in the middle of a torrential rainstorm. After 14 hours of agonizing labor, accompanied only by a kindly older nurse named Martha, Clara gave birth. Not to 1 child, but 2, a boy and a girl, fraternal twins. When the exhausted nurse handed the two swaddled bundles to her, Echo stared down into their faces and began to weep. The little boy had a mop of dark, unruly hair and a fierce, determined set to his tiny jaw, a spitting image of the Mafia boss who had demanded his erasure. The little girl was softer, with Echo's button nose and bright, observant eyes. She named them Oliver and Lily. "It's just the three of us now," Echo whispered into the quiet hospital room, kissing their foreheads. "I'll never let him find you, I promise." The next 4 years were a grueling, exhausting blur of survival. Raising twins as a single mother with no safety net, no family, and a constant, thrumming paranoia that the Rossi syndicate was hunting her, took its toll. Echo worked early morning shifts at a local bakery, hauling bags of flour before the sun came up, and took in freelance graphic design work at night using a cheap, refurbished laptop. Despite the poverty, despite the fear, she was happy. Oliver grew into a fiercely protective little boy who loved building towers out of wooden blocks and possessed a startling intelligence. Lily was a whirlwind of sunshine, constantly singing, covered in paint, and fiercely independent. Echo thought she had successfully outrun her past. New York felt like a different lifetime, and Gabriel Rossi was nothing more than a ghost she occasionally saw in her son's dark eyes. But Echo underestimated the sheer scale of the Rossi empire. By 2026, Gabriel hadn't just survived the federal RICO indictments, he had beaten them, expanding his legitimate businesses into massive real estate acquisitions across the country to launder his organization's billions. Rossi Holdings was aggressively buying up undervalued coastal properties to build luxury resorts. And their newest target was the quiet, struggling seaport town of Astoria, Oregon. The collision course was set. Echo's Bakery, the Salty Scone, sat right in the middle of the waterfront property Gabriel's front company had just purchased. The landlord had given all the tenants 30 days to vacate. Furious and desperate to save her sole source of income, Echo organized a town hall protest. She had successfully kept her face off the internet for 4 years, but in her desperation to protect her children's home, she agreed to be interviewed by a local Portland news station about the corporate buyout destroying small businesses. 3,000 miles away, in a penthouse overlooking the Manhattan skyline, Gabriel Rossi was sitting in his leather armchair, nursing a scotch, when his security chief turned on the television to show him the local pushback on their Oregon acquisition. Gabriel wasn't paying attention until he heard a voice he hadn't heard in 4 years, a voice that still haunted his nightmares. He snapped his head toward the screen. There, standing in the pouring rain in a cheap raincoat, her hair brown and short, looking exhausted but fiercely defiant, was the woman he thought had jumped off the Brooklyn Bridge 4 years ago. Gabriel's glass slipped from his hand, shattering against the hardwood floor. "Stop the broadcast," Gabriel commanded, his voice trembling with an emotion he hadn't felt in years. He stepped up to the massive screen, tracing the digital image of her face. "Get the jet ready. We're going to Oregon." The descent of a Gulfstream G650 into Portland International Airport was usually a matter of routine for Gabriel Rossi, but today, the cabin felt like a pressure cooker. He hadn't slept since seeing the broadcast. His mind was a fractured loop of the past 48 hours, deploying a team of former Mossad analysts to run facial recognition against the local Oregon news feed, tracing the bakery's business license, and finally pulling the property deed to a rundown cottage on the outskirts of Astoria. She was alive. For 4 years, he had mourned a phantom. He had torn New York apart looking for the men he assumed had kidnapped or killed her when she vanished from the Lenox Hill Clinic. Now, as a motorcade of 3 armored, pitch-black Chevy Suburbans tore down Highway 30 toward the coast, Gabriel's rage wrestled with an overwhelming, suffocating relief. The Suburbans rolled into Astoria like a storm front, their tires hissing against the rain-slicked pavement. They bypassed the commercial district and navigated the steep, winding residential roads overlooking the Columbia River. The lead vehicle pulled to a halt, a block away from a small, weather-beaten park. Gabriel stepped out into the freezing drizzle, ignoring the umbrella Hayes offered him. He wore a charcoal Brioni overcoat, looking entirely out of place amidst the mossy pines and rusting fishing boats below. He gestured for his men to hang back. He needed to do this alone. He walked toward the playground. The park was mostly empty, save for a solitary woman pushing 2 children on the swings. She was bundled in a heavy wool sweater, her back to him, laughing as one of the children squealed in delight. Gabriel's heart, hardened by a lifetime of violence and betrayal, hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He closed the distance, the fallen pine needles muffling his footsteps. "Higher, Mommy! Push me higher!" a little boy's voice demanded. "Hold on tight, Ollie," the woman replied. Her voice, the one that had echoed in Gabriel's empty penthouse for 4 agonizing years, ringing clear in the damp air. "Echo," Gabriel said. It wasn't a shout. It was a guttural rasp, barely louder than the wind off the river, but it struck her like a physical blow. Echo froze. The swing carrying the little boy arched forward and came back, but her hands stayed suspended in the air. Slowly, agonizingly, she turned around. The color instantly drained from her face, leaving her as pale as porcelain. Her eyes, wide and terrified, locked onto his. "Gabriel," she whispered, stepping instinctively backward, placing her body between him and the swings. He stared at her. Her hair was different, her clothes worn, the faint lines of exhaustion framing her eyes, but she was still the only woman who had ever dismantled his defenses. "I tore the East Coast apart for you," Gabriel said, his voice trembling with a terrifying blend of anger and awe. "I thought you were dead. You let me believe you were dead." "I had to be," Echo replied, her voice shaking but her chin tilting up in defiance. "You gave me no choice." Before Gabriel could formulate a response, the little boy on the swing dragged his boots in the wood chips to stop. "Mommy, who is that?" Gabriel's gaze snapped to the child. His breath hitched, stalling completely in his lungs. The boy, Oliver, was staring back at him with piercing, storm-cloud gray eyes. He had the same sharp jawline, the same unruly dark hair that Gabriel saw in the mirror every morning. Beside him, a little girl with Echo's exact nose and bright, inquisitive eyes hopped off her swing, hiding behind her mother's legs. Twins. The realization hit Gabriel with the force of a freight train. The timeline, the clinic, the lie. She hadn't just run away from him. She had run away with his children. The children he had ruthlessly ordered her to discard. "You," Gabriel pointed a shaking, leather-gloved finger at the boy. "You didn't go into the clinic." "No," Echo said fiercely, her protective instincts overriding her terror. "I didn't. I couldn't. And I knew if I stayed, you would never accept them. You told me yourself, Gabriel. You told me to get rid of it. So I got rid of us." "They're mine," he breathed, the reality sinking into his bones, rewriting his entire universe in a fraction of a second. He took a step forward, a desperate urge to touch them, to claim them, flooding his veins. "My son, my daughter." "Stay back!" Echo shrieked, pulling a small canister of pepper spray from her pocket with trembling hands. "They are not yours. They are mine. You gave up your right to them the moment you sent Hayes to escort me to an abortion clinic. You don't get to walk back into our lives because your front company accidentally bought my bakery." Gabriel stopped. The sight of Echo treating him like a predator, the same way his enemies looked at him before he pulled the trigger, cracked something deep within his soul. "Echo, please," he said, his voice dropping to a desperate, uncharacteristic plea. "I was a fool. I was terrified. I thought I was protecting you from my world. And look what your world just brought to my doorstep," she cried out, tears finally spilling hot down her freezing cheeks. "Men in black SUVs trailing you, burner phones, violence. You haven't changed, Gabriel. You're just richer. And I will die before I let you pull my babies into the darkness with you." Gabriel opened his mouth to argue, to demand they come with him to the safety of the estate, but the words died in his throat. A sharp, metallic crack echoed through the park, followed instantly by the whistling zip of a high-caliber round tearing through the bark of the pine tree inches from Gabriel's head. Gabriel's instincts, honed by decades of mob warfare, took over before conscious thought. "Get down!" he roared, lunging forward. He tackled Echo and the twins to the muddy ground just as a second shot shattered the plastic siding of the playground slide. At the edge of the park, two unmarked silver sedans had aggressively boxed in Gabriel's Suburbans. Men wielding suppressed AR-15s were pouring out. This wasn't local law enforcement. This was a hit squad. In his manic rush to cross the country, Gabriel had made a fatal error. He had flown unshielded. The Lucchese Syndicate, a rival family out of Chicago that Gabriel had spent the last 2 years systematically dismantling, had tracked his tail number. They had waited for him to isolate himself. "Hayes! Perimeter!" Gabriel screamed into the lapel microphone of his overcoat, pulling a matte black Glock 19 from his shoulder holster. Gunfire erupted, shattering the quiet Oregon afternoon. Hayes and the security detail engaged the hitmen, using the armored Suburbans as cover. But two of the shooters were flanking the park, moving through the trees directly toward the playground. "Mommy!" Lily screamed, burying her face in Echo's chest. Oliver was rigid with terror, his small hands clutching his mother's sweater. "I've got you. I've got you," Echo sobbed, shielding them with her body. Gabriel positioned himself solidly in front of his family, becoming a human shield. The Mafia boss who had once claimed a child would be a liability now felt an unprecedented, feral surge of purpose. He wasn't fighting for territory, or pride, or money. He was fighting for his blood. One of the gunmen rounded the climbing frame, raising his rifle. Gabriel didn't blink. He fired twice, the sharp reports of his Glock neutralizing the threat instantly. But the second shooter had an angle. A bullet grazed Gabriel's bicep, tearing through wool and flesh. He grunted, staggering but refusing to fall, returning fire and dropping the second assailant into the mud. Sirens began to wail in the distance, the local Astoria police finally responding to the war zone. The remaining Lucchese hitmen, realizing the element of surprise was gone and Gabriel's detail was too heavily armed, piled back into their sedans and screeched away, leaving their dead behind. Silence descended, heavy and smelling of sulfur and wet earth. Gabriel dropped to his knees in the mud, breathing heavily, blood seeping through his expensive coat. He didn't look at his wound. He looked frantically at Echo. "Are they hurt? Are you hit?" he demanded, his hands hovering over them, terrified to touch them and taint them with the blood on his hands. Echo was shaking violently, staring at the carnage around the park. "No," she whispered. "We're okay." She looked up at Gabriel. The ruthless, untouchable king of New York was kneeling in the dirt, bleeding, his eyes wide with a vulnerability she had never seen. He had literally taken a bullet to protect the children he had once ordered her to destroy. "You were right," Gabriel choked out, the adrenaline crashing, leaving behind raw, agonizing truth. "You were right to run. This is what I am. This is the poison I carry." He slowly holstered his weapon and forced himself to stand, clutching his bleeding arm. He looked down at Olive G. and Lily, his heart shattering into a million irreparable pieces. "I will sign the bakery over to you in perpetuity," Gabriel said, his voice hollow, resigned. "I will set up an untraceable trust for the twins. $400 million. You will never have to work another day in your life. And I will leave a security detail to watch from a distance. You'll never even know they are there." He turned away, limping back toward the bullet-riddled SUVs. He was going to walk away. He was going to give them the one thing he couldn't buy, freedom from him. "Gabriel, stop." The voice was shaky, but the command was absolute. Gabriel paused, turning his head. Echo had stood up, pulling the twins up with her. She looked at the dead men, then at Gabriel's bleeding arm, and finally into his eyes. "You think your money fixes this?" she asked, tears streaming down her face. "You think walking away absolves you?" "It keeps you alive, Echo," he rasped. "No," she said, taking a tentative step toward him. "It just leaves them without a father. If you want to protect us, you don't run away. You burn your empire to the ground." Gabriel stared at her, the gravity of her words settling over him. To leave the commission meant relinquishing absolute power. It meant cooperating with the very federal agencies he despised to dismantle his rivals permanently. It meant becoming a legitimate, boring man. He looked at Oliver, who was staring at him with wide, curious eyes, entirely devoid of the fear Gabriel was used to inspiring. "Burn it down," Gabriel whispered, a slow, determined fire igniting in his chest. Done. 5 years later, the sun set over the Amalfi coast, casting a golden hue over the sprawling terrace of the Rossi villa. Gabriel, wearing a simple linen shirt and trousers, leaned against the stone railing, watching his 9-year-old twins chase a stray cat through the lemon groves. It had taken 3 years of blood, legal maneuvering, and a highly classified immunity deal with the Department of Justice to completely dismantle the Rossi crime syndicate. He had surrendered his illegal ports, handed over the Lucchese family on a silver platter to the feds, and restructured Rossi Logistics into a purely legitimate, globally audited shipping corporation. He had traded his crown for peace, and it was the best trade he had ever made. Echo walked up softly behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist and resting her chin on his shoulder. He covered her hands with his, pulling her close. "They're getting faster," Gabriel murmured, smiling as Oliver tackled his sister onto the soft grass, both of them erupting into giggles. "They take after their father," Echo replied softly, pressing a kiss to his neck. "Stubborn, relentless." Gabriel turned in her arms, looking down into the eyes of the woman who had defied him, broken him, and ultimately saved him. "No," he said, kissing her forehead. "They take after their mother. They know exactly what's worth fighting for." If this story of betrayal, fierce survival, and a mafia boss's ultimate redemption kept you on the edge of your seat, make sure to hit that like button. Don't forget to share this incredible journey with your friends. And subscribe to the channel for more dramatic, real-life storytelling videos every single week. Drop a comment below. What would you have done in Echo's shoes? See you next time.